Okay, yeah. Thank you all for joining today and welcome to the first talk of this year. At our last talk, which was in late December, we had expressed solidarity with the protesting farmers for demanding state support and against corporate control of Indian agriculture. This is a community that's the most impacted by the climate crisis, and they're still protesting several weeks later. And we continue to express our solidarity with them. But in the meantime, over 150 of them have been arrested, and random FIRs launched against Siddharth Vardarajan and other journalists. As a teachers group, we completely condemn this indiscriminate use of state authority. It's not just the political fires that are raging, the planet is literally on fire. Since our last talk, we've got temperature data for 2020, and that indicates that 2020 was tied with 2016 for being one of the hottest years ever. It was a 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. And since then, even though the United States has rejoined the Paris Agreement, it's actually the structural factors of production and consumption, multiple inequalities and energy use that in fact are more significant. As a teachers group, our role is to disseminate information and multiple understandings of these structural factors that underlie the climate crisis, and also how different communities think, understand, and articulate it. And these talks, of which today is the 22nd, is part of that effort. And I'd like to thank Dr. Rosalind Bold for agreeing to speak today. Before I pass on the talk to Vandana Singh, who will conduct the talk today, just a few words that someone that all these talks are on our website, and a little bit about the program itself. So Dr. Bold will speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, after which it's opened out to questions, comments, and your thoughts. And you feel free to sort of include that in the chat box. But if you wish to come in and speak yourself, you're also welcome to do so. Maybe you can just indicate that in the chat box so we can take questions, and Vandana can take questions in the order in which they are in the chat box. So once again, thank you all for joining in today. And Vandana, over to you, and thanks. And thank you once again, Rosalind. Thank you for agreeing to speak today.
Welcome, everyone. It's my very great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Rosalyn Bold is a social anthropologist at University College London. Her work focuses on creating a cosmopolitics of climate change. She undertook her PhD fieldwork in Highland Bolivia and has published an edited volume on Indigenous Perceptions of the End of the World, Creating a Cosmopolitics of Change in 2019, as well as articles on pro-indigenous environmental law in Bolivia, some of which are forthcoming. And she has also published on the notion of the cosmoscape, which I'm sure she will explain to us, where she contrasts different worlding practices and how they converse with each other and how they contest each other in contemporary indigenous responses to extractivism. So her talk is going to be on this very important question of what relevance can indigenous and other non-Western environmental understandings have in creating climate change strategies. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us, Dr. Rosalyn Bold. Over to you.
Thank you, Vandana. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you everybody else for coming and expressing an interest in this theme. I'm just showing you a screen share there. I hope you can now all see the slideshow that I have. So first, I suppose a word about why I chose this image. I mean, this is a star nursery out in space. So it seems to me to be evocative of the birth of new worlds, which is what I want the theme of this presentation to touch on, really. With climate change, we're before a global problem. And so I feel very, very joyous that we have all of these people joining us from diverse locations across the world, and that we can make this exploration of what relevance how one continent is dealing with climate change can have for another, because climate change is, of course, a global problem that requires a global response. And of course, as we have here also, a very cross-disciplinary response as well, with perhaps enhanced conversations between the hard sciences, social sciences, and humanities to really develop a response to it. So what I'm going to do here today is I will spend the first part of the talk giving some theoretical background from the social sciences about what allows us to consider Amerindian and other sort of non-modern, non-scientific worlding practices so relevant in dealing with climate change. And what I will do with the second half of the talk is to give some direct ethnographic experience, both from my field site and, if we have time, from that of my friend Alessandro in Mexico, which was a chapter in the Indigenous Perceptions of Climate Change book that Vandana just mentioned. So, firstly, here's something of an introduction into the philosophical trend that we're working with. So when we say modernity in the social sciences, we use this to describe a world in which, according to the analyses of theorists like Bruno Latour, we've separated culture on the one side from nature on the other side. In the culture category, human beings and all our creations, and in the nature category, everything else, everything non-human. And according to Bruno Latour, it is this operation of separation that is the sort of the foundation stone of modernity's authority. But he also indicates that we have, in fact, never been modern. Science depends on the separation of society on the one side from nature on the other. Science describes nature apparently as it is, according to immutable natural laws. And we like to think that there is no trace of human prejudice in how we describe those. Science is objective. It's not mythology. That's why it's not mythology. There's no human content. There's no feelings. It simply is a description, an objective description of what is. Over on the society side of the equation, we have culture, we have politics, and we might also allow some limited space for storytelling, myth-making, and so on, but we would not consider that these were accurate descriptions of the real natural world, which science uniquely has the right to describe. So often where a modern cosmology comes up against the non-modern cosmologies, such as those of indigenous peoples in Latin America, for example, modernity tends to consider that whilst they may have pretty stories about how to describe the landscape, they may think, for example, a mountain is a god. It cannot really be a god, because what the mountain really is what science knows it to be. This is the dominant persuasion of modernity, in which we can see here the third part of this purification, as Latour refers to it, is taking God out of the equation. Where is God? He's not in nature. He's not in the tree outside the window. He's not in the mountain. He's the God of modernity is distant, transcendent, and accessed by spiritualism within the heart. So he's not particularly present in society either. This is a sort of rational society model which takes the divine out. And of course, this is something that maps onto a Christian worldview as well, as sort of as we attempt to describe the Europeans as an anthropological subject, or Euro-Americans as an anthropological subject. Christianity has one divine and distant being, God, whereas human beings are made in God's image. We have souls uniquely, unlike everything else. And like God, we have the creative capacity to act on nature. In the Bible, when God made the earth in 7 days, on the seventh, he turned it over to Adam and Eve and said, according to the dominant translation, this is your dominion, implying that they were the masters of it, that the rest of nature would be at their service. And human beings, uniquely resembling God, have souls that go up to heaven. Nothing else gets to have souls. There are no mountains don't have souls, dogs don't have souls, cats don't have souls. And of course, we can kind of we can say then souls kind of map onto beings that have culture, whereas the animal, plant, nature world, no souls, no capacity to create the dominion of human beings. This is just to sketch the sort of foundational myths of a modern Christian mindset. Now consciousness is not something that we discuss very much in the West. So I've left this slide in for your amusement. This is often how I have to describe to Western audiences the idea of consciousness. There's an author called Philip Pullman. I'm not sure if anybody has come across his work. It was recently made into a quite nice 12-part series. It's available on BBC iPlayer. What's it called? I can't remember what they've called that now, but there's oh, maybe people have come across his work, but this is, anyway, he gives a literary attempt to conceptualize consciousness, and he puts forward this theory of dust, which perhaps resembles dark matter, and is particles of pure consciousness, which come from the act of sustained concentration. As such, it clusters around human beings and their creations, as well as some imaginary creatures that he has, armored polar bears and mulefa, which are sort of elephants, because they can make tools, i.e. they have culture. So emanating from a Western projection, we might, reading between the lines, you might say that we associate consciousness with culture and this side of the equation. There is, that is to say, no consciousness in nature in a modern world. We connect culture to the capacity to create, reflect upon, order, and mute or silence these others. Latour holds that we are in fact de-animizing all the non-humans and depriving them of their voice in the world around them by limiting our conceptions of agency and intention to human beings, which is which sort of became a necessary prerequisite of the objectivity of science as science evolved in the 1800s. When I look down a microscope, the scientist, reflect on matter. I do not expect the matter at the bottom of my microscope or at the other end of my telescope to be reflecting back on me. The act of objective reflection is and should be a one-way operation in science, which is beautifully parodied by Douglas Adams in his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, with his laboratory white mice who are in fact running the entire Earth as an experiment of theirs. I don't know if anybody's come across that, but he brilliantly inverts, thereby challenging the scientific paradigm or the assumptions underlying the modern scientific paradigm. Now, if we look to conceptions of consciousness in Amerindian worlds, in the Andes or Puebla, which are the two field sites I will be telling you about today, in Philip Pullman's projection, everything would have dust clustered around it, particularly mountains, which are divine and conscious entities capable of affecting and acting upon humans and existing in relations of fruitful exchange with them, which we'll look more at in detail later. Often called animism by anthropologists, this is a common feature of culture among many peoples worldwide, the immanence of God, or the immanence of the divine in the landscapes around them, and that those relationships should thereby be governed by relations of respect. Now, my interest in presenting this to you and in sort of bringing these ideas to India is what kind of conversation then emerges when we start introducing Latin American cosmologies to a continent where there are elaborate philosophical conversations stretching for thousands of years, which potentially provide vital academic tools for reconceptualizing consciousness and the interrelations between entities. Where does India come into this cosmopolitics? As well as the fascinating conversations happening in quantum physics on this score. Currently, here my focus is on the sort of what we might call cosmo-environmental applications, and just an idea of something that might be relevant here. For example, interdependent origination, as described in the net of Indra. Wonderful quote here, attributed to the Buddha. If untold Buddha lands are reduced to atoms, in one atom are untold lands, and as in one, so in each. The atoms to which these Buddha lands are reduced in an instant are unspeakable, and so are the atoms of continuous reduction moment to moment, going on for untold eons. These atoms contain lands unspeakably many, and the atoms in these lands are even harder to tell of. And such framings are becoming increasingly relevant to science as it is increasingly interested in reconceptualizing the world according to reciprocal frames of interlinked micro and macro levels. For example, the microbiotics of the body. We now know that much of the genetic material we carry within our bodies is not human genetic material, but is in fact different bacterias, creating a sort of internal ecology, which this healthy maintenance of which our health depends upon. And of course, the ecology that we have within reflects the wider ecology within which we are situated, what we eat, drink, and encounter on an everyday basis. This sort of reciprocality is also making a feature in natural biology in terms of the discovery of the importance of rhizomes and rhizomic networks in environments. So it's sort of replacing the model of independent competition of species. We find out that a complex environment like a forest is connected by rhizomes under the ground, which are sharing information between different species constantly, and helping, and different species are helping each other to survive and deal with threats like natural predators, sharing nutrients and so on. So these are sort of complementing the more individualistic and competitive aspects of the natural selection model. As anthropologist Henrietta Moore indicates, the debates in modern science, with their complex relationalities that morph into socialities, look perplexingly like indigenous ontologies. That is to say, many of the indigenous peoples that we're working with are living in worlds that are already connected across the micro and macro cosmic levels, and are already interdependent and interrelated. Ideas which science is now, as it were, getting its head around. So with that, I think the relevant question that I and others working within the school which I'm a part of are trying to ask is, what can indigenous and non-Western knowledge teach science or modernity about environment and sustainability? This is of course, particularly pressing problem in the present, because we seem to have reached a point where modernity is creating a sort of drastic environmental crisis, both at a physical level and also at an ideological level. Climate change has created a crisis in how we see the world, where nature is acting upon culture in uncontrollable ways: flash floods, flooding, melting glaciers, watershed change, and hurricanes, and so on. Now, the problem is, in order to appease nature and stop them happening, we have to change culture. So nature is now forcing culture to change. We no longer can pretend that there is this objective relationship of nature being something that I look at through a microscope and over which I have dominion. It's very difficult with climate change to think about nature as a series of resources which I have the authority to boss around, because the crisis is coming precisely as a result of human control over resources, human abuse of resources, perhaps, and we're being forced to live the consequences of this, which is creating a crisis in the modern worldview. It seems we'll have to stop using natural resources in the extractivist way that we are currently doing as the raw material for culture. As Latour indicates, it is this fundamental assumption that nature is at the service of society that underlies and enables extractivist capitalism, which is the source of climate change. So motivation for allowing us to consider other worldviews and how they might help us to reconsider the world. Hence the birth of cosmopolitics. Climate change creates a unique opportunity to converse across cultural lines, as it is happening to us, all of us globally at the same time. And we note at this moment that some cultures seem to be living more sustainably than others without significantly contributing to climate change. How are they doing this? Isabel Stengers came up with this beautiful notion called cosmopolitics, in which we could consider non-humans and the cosmological perspectives that incorporate them, their sentience, their agency, their right to exist. This, of course, showing a rupture from the modern labeling of the world, in which the political sphere is limited only to human beings. This is a sort of anthropocentric divide in which nature is not invited to the democratic table. Cosmos in Stenger's rendering refers to the unknown constituted by multiple divergent worlds and the articulations of which they could eventually be capable. Rather than equivalence between worlds, rather than making all worlds the same, she says we should view all worlds and worlding practices as equal. No one worlding view, no one cultural understanding is more right than any other one. Her whole aim is to introduce the idea of doubt into hegemonic notions such as the modern conviction that science has the unique right to describe the world and that human beings are our only significant political actors. Such cosmopolitical conversations are crucial in a context of environmental, economic and climatic crises and increased extractive activity. According to sort of social science theorists like Donofsky, Vivers de Castro and Latour, who've taken up these ideas of Stengers, who is a philosopher of science. Also, similarly, Marisol de la Cadena, Mario Blazer, myself in my lesser way, we're taking up this notion to cosmopolitics to articulate the perspectives of the indigenous peoples we work with as valid worldviews, as valid ways of conceiving and enacting relationships with environments. So across Latin America, indigenous movements are bringing earth beings, actors such as animate mountains and so on, into mainstream politics. After 500 years of Christianization, these heretical beliefs are still here despite consistent attempts at Christianization, and contemporary indigenous politicians are asking how these colonial and indigenous worlds can co-reside in a relation of respect. A question more pertinent than ever as extractivism penetrates further into indigenous territories and national parks across the world. Such worlding practices have a significant capacity to disrupt a modern politics that has hitherto excluded them. As Marisol de la Cadena describes a case in southern Peru, Andean peoples opposed a mining project on the grounds that it would decapitate a mountain. And they not only opposed it in terms of the mountain being their territory, but they contested it in terms of the fact that was widely believed across all classes of society in the region that if treated in this way, the mountain would take a terrible revenge and that people would die in earthquakes and explosions and various other natural phenomena as a result of their mistreatment of the mountain and the abuse of the relationship of reciprocity in which they and the mountain should be immersed. There have been some objections to the ontological turn, which I put this up in case anybody's interested in going into the more. When we say the ontological turn, we mean the turn towards the focus on the nature of being. Who gets to be a being? With this turn, we're really trying to shake up the foundations of a Western cosmology and extend our notions of being more widely than the model in which only humans are really beings with souls. But the problem that this sometimes runs into is that we are concerned that we might be trying to reify ontologies and to separate them too neatly, whereas really I think we see lots of worlding practices continually running into one another. I came up with the notion of cosmoscapes to describe worlds in which people might sometimes believe that the mountain is a god and is an actor, and might at other times believe it is a series of natural resources for them to mine. There have been some recent successes in realizing cosmopolitics, and India is a world leader here, with 3 rivers being assigned juridical personhood. Similarly, in Bolivia, which is my field site, we've seen the passing of the law of Mother Earth, which attributes juridical personhood to the earth itself. So if anybody abuses the earth by by extractivism, they can be taken to court and tried for this as a crime. And this process is being put into international law by the tremendously successful Stop Ecocide campaign, who are campaigning to make this an international crime like genocide, which could be enforced by the United Nations. And I think the particular importance of the field site which I've chosen, these small-scale Amerindian communities with their sustainable technologies, open to complex syncretic assemblages and modest human population sizes, could be considered one of the possible chances of a subsistence of the future in a sustainable world which is adapting to and mitigating climate change. In my edited volume, we focused on a series of such communities to describe Indigenous perspectives on the end of the world. Consulting such communities on whether the world is ending, whether and why it has ended before, and how we can change contemporary practice to make it sustainable. Can it be saved? What does climate change look like to those who consider that the elements and landscape are imbued with what we might tentatively call consciousness, the capacity to reflect, act, and feel? We consider how these communities are equivocating, making their views be heard on an equal footing in cosmopolitical arenas, and compare attempts by modern scientists to communicate with them, creating cross-cultural rapprochement. So now I will introduce a couple of chapters from this book. Firstly, my own work on the Kalawaya people of Apolobamba in Highland Bolivia, and then we'll move on to my friend Alessandra's work. I do hope you'll let me know if we're running out of time, maybe 5 minutes before the end, so I can make sure we don't get too carried away. So here's a lovely picture of my field site here. High mountains, about 3,600 meters above sea level. I think that mountain there is about, you can see with the snow on top, goes up to about 5,000 or more. So very, very reminiscent of the high Himalaya, this landscape. And I think what drew me to this field site was 40 years ago, a chap called Joseph Bastian wrote a now classic ethnography called Mountain of the Condor, writing that the Cateños, the people of Cata, this village, perceive the mountain they inhabit to be a living body. Cata lies on the stomach or center of this mountain body. So the mountain has a head, it has eyes, which are high mountain lakes. It has feet which are down in the valleys, but Cata is on the stomach in the middle, where they grow all the potatoes, which people living at all levels of the mountain rely on for the main subsistence. The people of this mountain are also diviners. Bastian records that to read the misfortune of a plaintive coca leaves, which is of course a sort of a sacred leaf which has mild stimulant properties, would be thrown on a mat, or a guinea pig, which they use for food, would be cut open. The patterns formed by the coca leaves as they fall, or the liver spots of the guinea pig, would reflect where in the plaintiff's body illness or misfortune was located. The human body was then cured by curing the pertaining point of the mountain body. A simple example, if somebody were to come to you with a broken heart, we might go to that part of the heart part of the mountain, and we might dispose of horrible things, burn them and throw the ashes in the river and have them cleaned out of the mountain body. So by relating with the mountain landscape, the bigger and more powerful body, we can make changes in the fractally related but smaller human body. And this fractal aspect of the landscape is also mirrored in the body of the guinea pig or of the pattern of the coca leaves. We see a sort of fractal symmetry across scale in these landscapes. So this is a landscape of reflection and interrelation across scales. Another lovely vicarious picture there of the valley where I work, all of these carefully constructed terraced fields with long fallow periods in between harvests, allowing people to extract a good living, a good subsistence living from these high mountain slopes. Of course, the Andes are tropical mountains, so they get less cold in the winter than do the high Himalaya. And in these mountains, exchange relationships are one of the crucial organizing features of social life, and these are called aini. If I work on somebody's field for a day, for example, they will return me a day of their labor, like for like. This is Aini between humans, and keeps the community from having to interrelate with one another through cash economy relations. It's an exchange of like for like. And similarly to this, with a similar etymological root, manai offerings are made to the mountains, winds, and other deities, with hope that they will return gifts to humans. So, for example, the new fields that are to be ploughed each year are the subject of much celebration in a very important springtime ritual just before the planting season begins, in which they are celebrated, music is played for them, libations are poured for them, offerings of flowers filled with honey are left in crevices of the mountains to feed the landscape. And in return, the fields, the mountains will feed us with the food that is produced in their fields. We feed them also with our labor when we work, but alone that labor would be insufficient. It must be carried out as part of these relationships of respect with an animate landscape. And when carried out correctly, these constitute the balance of a healthy landscape consisting of people, animals, gods, plants, and ancestors. Very much Rosalind Heidegger's dwelling perspective. This is a view from my house in the village of the old square at the top of the mountain. It's a very powerful site. There used to be ancestral mummies buried underneath here. This was the very heart of the mountain body. Recently, however, the ancestral mummies were taken out and they were sold to archaeologists from Cusco, a fact that many of the community are very outraged about, demonstrating I think that there are different cosmological tendencies at play here. You know, for some of the community, the mummies were deities, and yet for others, they could be sold for money. And there's constant debate and argument between these two sets of welding practices, with schooling having been introduced in the last couple of generations in the village. People are now being increasingly encouraged to believe that the beliefs of their parents are simply uneducated and wrong because they are non-modern. However, they still have a kind of pull. So hence these relationships of contestation and their elaboration into what I call a cosmoscape, an interlayering of different cosmological models which come to the fore in different moments. This is the sort of the more modern lower part of the village with some government built houses with red roofs. You can see there. This is the villagers celebrating in that square. You can see this is a sort of Christianized celebration, but their gods and saints all wear the same clothes as they do, this particular poncho and hat. And here they are celebrating the four corners of this square. Fiestas are really very important here. And as you can see, these fiestas are becoming increasingly kind of national in tendency. They're changing in their nature, which is something that the old people used to complain about a lot, that the fiestas were now no longer purely about celebrating the landscape, but the themes of them were changing, and often the young people failed to participate in the fiestas. So these dancers here are brought in from the capital city, La Paz, to replace the young people who now don't play music and dance in the fiestas as they used to. And this is seen as a crucial part of the health of the land. But these days there's so much migration and such a sort of change in thinking that young people have ceased to carry out these responsibilities. Alcohol is and remains a very important part of fiestas. Drinking in a sort of public house of sorts, which had opened up on the ground floor of the house which I was inhabiting during the festival, pumping out very loud music for the 5 days that it continued. The chap there on the left was the community leader at the time. My friend Alejo was in charge of buying the drinks for these fiestas because he had a small mine on the community lands. So he was extracting value from the landscape. Now, mining is a traditional activity, but it's generally carried out in very ritualized ways. There is shaft mining to extract nuggets of gold, which are thought to grow like potatoes in the inside of the mountain. Whereas what Alejo was carrying out was a type of mining that involved sort of taking away an entire section of the mountain in his one-man JCB, putting it in the back of a truck and taking it to Potosi and selling it as minerals. And in a line with a sort of modern philosophy, there was no altar to celebrate the mountain as he did this. And I think a generation or two ago, that kind of mining would have been seen as unacceptable. But as things are changing these days, it was viewed as being okay, provided that he bought all of the booze for fiestas as an attempt to kind of feed back into the community. However, one day as he was going to, in mid-fiesta, as he went down to the main town on this very windy little one-track mountain road there, dirt road, the four-wheel drive he was driving slipped off the road, and 5 passengers were killed outright as the vehicle plunged into the side of the mountain. The driver himself survived, I think, due to a driver's airbag. After this cataclysmic event, the other worldviews sort of came to the fore, in which the mountain was a powerful, sentient actor capable of exacting revenge on human beings. I realized that most people in the community felt that the accident had happened as the blood price of Alejo's mine. Through taking too much, the mountain had extracted a terrible revenge and taken the lives of 5 men to pay the price of all the minerals that he was extracting. So as well as challenging, there are important ways in which these cosmoscapes complement and agree with one another. We see in that model that mining in that way is incompatible with the Aini balance of the landscape, of the traditional landscape here in Qatar. So there's a conflict in that case between 2 different worldviews. However, they also agree on some things, such as waste, for example. The scientific view holds that plastic waste and batteries contaminate the land, which people there, since they learned that these things were contaminants, agree with. According to their fractal landscape, they find human bodies in the mountain to reflect each other. So any contamination put into the land is simultaneously a contamination to human beings. Plastic waste contaminates the mountain body as the chemical food it contains contaminates humans. Worse, this food does not nourish. Only food containing hard work and reciprocal relations was thought to nourish. I hypothesize that the nutritional value of food is derived from the landscape, that this is the fruit of healthy exchange relations between humans and earth beings. So this fractal relationship between human and mountain bodies makes sense also from a modern perspective. We also consider that industrially produced foods are less nourishing than the organic fruits of subsistence farming. So we have, in that case, the same phenomenon viewed through the prism of 2 different worlds, which agree with each other or coincide, as they might say in the Andes. And some lovely organic crops there. People in this village will not use pesticides or artificial fertilizers. They experimented with them when they were offered on some small areas of land, but then concluded that whilst they made things grow well for a couple of years, after that nothing would grow at all because they killed the animals in the soil that were necessary to aerate the soil. Some insects are good, they told me. The earth has little holes in it. These are real pores. It can't breathe at all when we spray it with pesticides. This metaphor of pores is, of course, coherent with the mountain body metaphor. The mountain has in their conception a skin with pores that can get blocked, and they will stop the mountain from being able to breathe healthily. So they're combining this animistic association of the mountain body with good hard empiricism in having tried the chemicals on a couple of small sites before rolling them out to all of their fields. And to come up with conclusions that science widely agrees with. Science also points out that our use of artificial chemicals is damaging the soil. So why are we using so many of these pesticides in more modern contexts, even as we can scientifically see that soil health is declining and there are grave predictions made by the United Nations, yet farmers are still using them with grave effects on both their personal health and on that of the landscape. It would seem oddly here that we have in this Cosmoscape some Andean peasants who are more empirical, more scientific than the scientific West. So this idea of the mountain as a body makes sense for agriculture. Gardeners also refer to their plants as though they could think, feel, and have like senses to human bodies. Even in the West, that is, people often refer to their plants in this way. and the UNFA in 2011 published their Wake Up Now report, championing the virtues of small-scale organic agriculture, which keeps soils healthy. The diversity of crops and cultivars means that there is a greater adaptive capacity. So this is a useful, indeed, a vital strategy in the context of climate change. However, absorbing this requires a change of theoretical perspective away from a modern world, away from the so-called green revolution practices, and towards a world which involves a more intimate interrelation with our landscapes. Thus, it's providing something of a challenge. So in conclusion here, the perspective of the village of Kata, the animate mountain, Aini exchange relationships, its refusal to exceed the capacity of the land, are vital strategies for healthy living. Agricultural intensification was in itself viewed simply as greed, an attempt to take too much from the exchange relationships of the mountain environment, and one that would necessarily have dangerous consequences. A further advantage of this system in the context of climate change is that it's highly adaptable. People consider that crops are moving up the mountain as temperatures increase. They sort of talk about it as if the crops were doing this on their own. Being sentient and animate beings, they're deciding to grow themselves at different altitudes, and human beings are simply facilitating this with their actions. This is not a perspective of dominion in which human beings are telling plants where to grow and trying to force them to grow in environments which might not suit them. The high diversity of cultivars and wild plants in this environment means that the ecosystem is diverse and quicker to adapt to change than a monoculture environment with chemical fertilizers and pesticides. This has been found, like the more complex an environment, the more different species that compose an environment, the greater its capacity to adapt to climate catastrophe, the greater its resilience in a context of climate change. Because different species are likely to react better than others. And also it somehow seems to increase the overall intelligence of the system in a way that we're not quite sure how to map yet, but nonetheless is demonstrable. So while we in the West worry about the effects of climate change on marginal and poor peoples, it is perhaps in the modern and industrialized world that we most will struggle to cope with these changes. Change in an animate world is expected. When everything is alive, it might do anything. There is no expectation of control. And I think that the sort of sustainable environmental relations that places like Kata imbue are very dependent on these perceptions of spirits residing in and owning the resources on which we depend. And this ensures balanced relationships of humans within environments, seeing us as inseparable from, and indeed the creations of these environments, rather than the nature culture or Christian perspectives of dominion over them. The utility of the fractal world for climate change is that actions and effects are inseparable, and rather than worrying about culture and nature, we have a seamless world of interactions, which is more capable of dealing with a cross-cultural, cross-natural phenomenon like climate change. For the people of Kata, climate change is simply as a phenomenon, is a mood of the world, as something which is happening to all of us at the same time. This bears some similarities to Latour's conceptualization of climate change as the revenge of Gaia, who was of course the Greek earth goddess, on the naturalist perspective that silences the natural world, the modern perspective that silences the natural world, that is. And we would add, takes excessively and inconsiderately as a result of considering it simply unconscious raw material. And I think I am not going to have time to describe Alessandro's work there. If anybody is interested in it, you can, his book chapter is available on his website, but suffice to say, as a sort of brief conclusion, that this idea that spirits are inherent in landscapes was a common feature across all of the indigenous worlds that we looked at in the book. And the idea that what was really important in the sustenance and the maintenance of any world was rituals of respect with spirits. people say that when we stop conducting the rituals, that's when the world will end. This was common across all the field sites. It was very interesting. And what this led to in several places, such as Alessandro's field site in Puebla in Mexico, was the revitalization of rituals of respect to landscape deities, the revitalization of native traditions amongst young people, even when they had migrated to the capital city, lived a very modern life and moved back again. And then people were using these ways of envisioning the landscape as a way of challenging mining corporations that were seeking to take their land and resources from them. So it seems like these myths and stories here, which imbue forests and land with spirits who are their rightful owners and will share with and provide us with what we need, as long as we don't ask for too much, as long as we don't try and take out the heart of the mountain, the minerals inside it, or cut down all the trees until there's no forest left. It seems that these myths or worldviews are key to sustainable cultural practice. And we'll end there, and I'll be very happy to receive your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosalind, for an utterly fascinating and incredibly relevant talk. I would like to invite people to put questions in the chat, and so that we can try to take them in order as much as possible. I think we already have, I'm looking at the chat over here, yes. We have one from Anne Snick, where she says, is part of the problem not that Western people or even the UN consider subsistence economies as poor and think they're doing something good, for example, SDG 1, no poverty, by forcing modern agricultural and economic models upon them? So do you consider that to be part of the problem?
Precisely, and yes, exactly. And hence the relevance of this cosmopolitics perspective that aims to create doubt and uncertainty, to sort of unseat the modern conviction that we know what poverty is, we know what's good for people. We sort of these modern agricultural and economic models, these are the future, these are the way for all people. We're seeking just to unseat those certainties by looking at the existing worlding practices that people who perhaps are labeled poor or marginalized might have, and to look at how they have been in many cases engendering sustainable relationships with these environments for a very long time, which often are attempts at modernization, sort of abruptly bring to an end by sort of forcing a sort of development model, which isn't perhaps always appropriate.
And in fact, a development model that's informed by exactly those features of modernity that you described. Yeah. So I have half a dozen questions myself. I'll restrain myself to one at the moment. Before, actually, there's another question from Lavanya. Let me take that first. So Lavanya says, does not anthropomorphism also have the problem of being anthropocentric? So how would you respond?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a very interesting question, and of course there are so many different worldviews that look at natural phenomena in the landscape in different ways. So your question reminds me of Amazonia, where Eduardo Viveros de Castro was one of the first people to really explore this ontological, the sort of ontological categories of being there, and he saw that So jaguars eat human beings, and jaguars and human beings both eat this kind of like native wild pig called a tapir, right? Now, in the minds of all of those creatures, when they go home, they all sit down, they drink some maize beer, and they all eat some tapir before they go to bed. Like the jaguar is living in a world where the human is that's what the human sees, and that's also what the tapir sees. When we encounter each other, when we encounter a jaguar, the jaguar sees a tapir, and we see a jaguar, and then the jaguar eats us, but it thinks it's just hunting a tapir and taking it home. When we see a tapir, the tapir looks at us and sees a jaguar, whereas we see a tapir and then we eat that and take it home. So they hold there that all beings are in fact human by default, that we all have the same culture, yet naturally we are all different, and we appear different to one another in relationality. And I think they also hold that all beings were originally human in various parts of the Amazon, and we became became different things. So that is, of course, quite an anthropomorphic world, we could say, but it's also one that posits an equivalence between human and what we might call non-human perspectives, and unseats the very idea of what being a human being is. But within the Catan perspective, I don't know, because perhaps I certainly feel that while the mountain is said to have the organs of a human body, I feel that fits in a fractal landscape where we're kind of copies of the mountain. The mountain is more powerful than a human being. It has a greater capacity to act than a human being. And even the clothes that people wear, the ponchos with the little pointy hats that you see, that men wear, these seem to be making a human body into a mountain body shape. We seem to be copying the mountain as well. And women tend to wear these very big flared skirts, which similarly make them look like mountains. And the detail on the ponchos that people are wearing is in fact depicting all the different levels of the mountain and the flora and fauna that thrive at its different levels. And people wear these particular ponchos only for ceremonial occasions. So it's like when they have to interact with the mountain in a generative way, in a sort of ritualistic way to make particular things happen, they dress themselves like copies of the mountain in order to be able to engage creatively with it. So there's certainly a sort of reciprocity happening there. And of course, in every place, the way in which you conceive of and relate with landscape beings might look totally different.
So what you're saying is not the anthropomorphism as we normally consider anthropomorphism to be, because the human is part of this fractal landscape, and that other beings are more powerful or as powerful as the human, right? That's how I understand.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Rather than trying to turn everything else into human beings, we're looking for common elements across landscapes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we have a question from Patricia, who would like you to speak a bit more on the socio-political mechanisms which have evolved in wise societies to control human greed, and how are these perpetuated and maintained over time?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Thank you. Yes, greed was really brought to the fore in my field site as being something that was undesirable. So when the chap who I mentioned, when he had his car accident, people referred to him as an addict, which I was really surprised by, because I couldn't see that he was addicted to any particular substance. He wasn't an addict in the sense which we might use the word. And after a sort of while of puzzling, I worked out that what they meant by an addict was someone who took too much from the social whole for themselves. So as long as I'm sharing with people, it's good that I consume. But as soon as I try and draw that consumption too much towards myself, there's a wonderful theorist called Eric Wolff, who's one of our sort of core Marxist theories or theorists of peasant world, sort of writing in the 1960s. And he says that often peasants conceive the world as like a sort of pie, and if you try and take too big a slice of pie, it necessarily means that other people, and I would argue non-human persons also, are going to have less. So this principle of equivalence can give rise to creeds like that of envy, which was the discourse of envy is quite widespread across Mediterranean countries. If you have too much of anything, you then have to fear the evil eye, the envy of your neighbors, which would bring bad luck upon you and prevent you from having too much. So that's just one way in which the sort of the fear of greed can be kind of socially, politically played out. Or I think also there's a fascinating, there are so many different examples that I could give, but I also think about the ayahuasca shamans described by Michael Tausig in the sort of upper reaches of the Amazon in Colombia. And he describes a relationship between the lowlands, which were colonized, the Amazon jungles, which were colonized for rubber extraction, by the highlands, which consider themselves more white, more akin to the Spanish colonial mestizo class, and the jungles are a more Indian or a more wild or a more native kind of space. During the rubber boom, they were ruthlessly colonized, and the Indians were enslaved to bring rubber out for export for the enrichment of the highlands. And he conceives that there is an illness called envy, which is brought by bad winds, which afflicts some of the colonized people of the highlands. And to cure themselves, they come down to the ayahuasca shamans of the sort of highland Amazon, who bring not only the ayahuasca, which is a sort of hallucinogenic substance derived from Banisteriopsis, I think, vine, which comes from the Amazon jungles, but also the accoutrements of the jungle, jaguar skins, tobacco smoke, rattles, and they perform curative ceremonies, immersing these people in a very indigenous landscape. And also the ayahuasca is said to bring people realizations through an introspective examination of their own nature. This is said to bring a sort of this is sort of an act of forgiveness, as it were, for the brutal internal colonialism of the country, and as people assuaging their guilt by coming down and asking for forgiveness and receiving in return healing. So this, again, another way in which societies are kind of socio-politically balancing out the tendency to take too much and the reverberations of the evil winds that can follow from the knowledge of such acts. There always has to be some form of coming to terms with the consequences of your actions, possibly before your other. It's another strategy.
Well, I wonder if something like that would, we don't have rituals like that in modernity. And, I just had a mental vision of, our techno billionaires being subject to something like that. But there is no such thing. Okay, wonderful. Okay, a question from Rajeshwari, and this actually echoes something that I'm also interested in asking. Rajeshwari says, I worry about the notion of blaming science. Should we also worry about how economics looks at individual production, consumption, and commodities, while mountain people look at relationships and have norms and rules about these relationships?
Yes, I don't mean to blame science. I'm apologizing if it sounds like that sometimes, as I'm sort of oversimplifying the content of what I'm trying to say. I don't mean to blame science at all. What I mean is and I think that within science, science is an act of discovery. It's science if you're challenging the knowledge which you have by continuously growing outward, and so within science we see these wonderful studies of rhizomes and interactive microbiotics, quantum physics and so on, and people really pushing out the boundaries. What I'm seeking to do is to join up the edges of the scientific enterprise with other welding practices which are already in existence, because not to do so is lazy science. A true scientist would not dismiss such a thing as being unreal unless it had been demonstrably proven to be so. A true scientist would investigate the nature of such worldviews. So I think, that's what we're sort of trying to do. And of course, I agree that individual production and consumption, and precisely, there is this, we now live within this neoliberal economic tendency that, like modernity, and I'm afraid, like some formulations of science, tend to see a unique, like Christianity used to do, a unique right way for the world as emanating from the particular creeds of Western Europe. So hence our attempts, Latour's attempt to anthropologically consider these cultures and to sort of take them apart in much the same way as we like to take apart other cultures, and to analyze their fundamental tenets. And I think what we really need to do is we need to bring these cultures into equivocation, right? So rather than modernity, mainstream neoliberal economics, sort of putting itself on a pedestal above other worldviews, I think we just need to kind of bring it down to a point where it can discourse with other worldviews in an equal way. Yes, and that might indeed involve a very different model of economics, which isn't so focused on first on growth, on extractivism, on fostering individual consumption, and it's we need to, each one of us, challenge our the hegemonic worldview that fosters these things before we can kind of get past it and start interrelating with our landscapes in different ways. And I don't really think we can wait for economics to show us this, but it's important to kind of imaginatively move our way out of those and into new sets of relationships, because often, you know, as consumers, we are in a way kind of driving the whole machine.
And indeed, it seems to me from your talk that, you know, there's a sort of, we who live in modernity, you know, are deprived of, are poor in that richness of interrelationships that you describe, that is the norm in communities like the one that you've worked in.
Indeed, yes.
So, so we have a question from Amita, where she says the ideas of the sacredness of nature, for example, within Hinduism, have also been used to marginalize and exclude non-Hindu communities, as well as lower caste groups. How do we bring modern ideas of equality to bear upon dominant religious beliefs? And I just want to add one thing to it, that indeed in India, there has been, you know, the kind of muscular, so, you know, Hindutva, Hinduism that has been appropriated for political reasons by the leaders is indeed, among other things, part of the, I would say, a war against tribals and tribal culture, indigenous peoples in India, and to kind of take in, to not recognize that they have different religious practices. And then, of course, it's been used against Muslims as well. So as Amita says, how do we bring modern ideas of equality, modern in quotes, ideas of equality to bear upon dominant religious beliefs?
Yes, well, isn't that a wonderful field of study and political inquiry to open up, precisely. And I think within cosmopolitics, there is no hierarchy. You know, so Hinduism has a very sort of strict hierarchy governing all forms of life. But within cosmopolitics, there is no hierarchy of worldviews. So so let's say some non-Hindu communities or tribal peoples, their worldview would have to be seen as just as valuable and having just as much of a contribution to make as Hinduism. Similarly with Muslims or Buddhists or Sikhs or whatever. And you know, India was a cosmopolitical paradise for many centuries. So I don't think that this is perhaps, you know, in some ways was a cosmopolitical paradise, according to my very limited knowledge of it for many centuries. So the beginnings of such a perspective may indeed already be there. I mean, the fact that there is there is such a diversity of communities within contemporary India must say something about the fostering of diversity somehow within that model. And I wonder if it isn't a little somehow the case that as with everywhere else in the world, what we're really seeing at this moment right now is an unprecedented effort to take indigenous native people's lands away from them in order to foster more extractivism. So, you know, the decimation of these tribal communities, which have somehow continued for thousands of years as part of the sort of complex jigsaw of India. And indeed, and I think we sort of need to bring it down to equality, but also where I hope Latin America is perhaps a useful part of this conversation is that we, you know, there have been really remarkable initiatives around indigenous land rights, and you know, in sort of international. And I don't think we can call equality. Modernity does not have a unique hold over equality. That's something that various human societies and cultures might want. We do see sort of it formalized as part of the sort of liberal underpinnings of international organizations like the United Nations, for example, which has a code of human rights, which has been very useful for indigenous movements within South America to refer to. These are large, powerful entities, these international organizations within countries, and indigenous peoples have had recourse to their resources and to allow them to fund their mobilizations around their territories. We've seen really remarkable things happening with that. So in Bolivia, the last president was, sort of claimed an indigenous identity. His political party have now returned to power, which was, which was really a very exceptional thing to happen when we sort of consider that Bolivia had for many years been governed by a very tiny, close-knit colonial elite who considered that the majority of the country were a different race to them, were below them, and simply shouldn't get a say in mainstream politics. Like, obviously, it's been sort of very contested. There have been a number of very vehement struggles in the course of Bolivia's history over this, but now we see a moment where indigenous philosophies, ideas, and politicians are right at the mainstream. So it is possible that these kind of changes can be realized, and I think that any Bolivian person would attribute this not only but also very crucially to the strength of the indigenous movements, to their conviction and to their desire to fight and to struggle to demarcate their own territories and to have autonomy over them, the right to make decisions or the right to be consulted as to large-scale extractivist projects that might take place in those territories. And also, I think the power, and that may be fed into by an international process that is increasingly recognizing the rights of indigenous and marginalized peoples over territory, to bring that into mainstream politics.
So we have a question from Vasudha. And by the way, I want to remind everybody who has questions that you can also, when I call out your name, if you want to unmute yourself and turn on your video and ask the question, that's fine too. So Vasudha is asking, I was struck by the way climate change is adaptation by plants using agency. And would you like to comment or elaborate on that, the notion of plants having agency?
Yes, could we perhaps ask Vasudha what you mean by that a little more closely? Perhaps you'd like to just pop in for a minute.
Yeah, Vasudha, can you clarify a little bit? Is Vasudha still here?
I have to unmute yourself.
I don't see Vasudha here right now.
Well, perhaps if we do get Vasudha, could we return to that question, because I'm...
Okay, yeah, I like that idea. Okay, so we are going to go to, so Mayank has a question about, let me see, maybe you've already sort of answered this.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, okay, so shall we skip that question then?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we have, we have a question from Clem. Perhaps the worldview is as it is because of the underlying dynamics of the life of the people, specifically the close connection between the people and the environment. Unfortunately, most of us are, sorry, this keeps scrolling. Yeah, most of us have lost that connection. Can we learn from indigenous communities how we might find that connection again in our modern work? Climate change is already trying to alert us, but most of us are still too remote from the environment to listen. So how can we find that, can indigenous communities help us find that connection again, is the heart of the question.
Yes, I agree that connection is what's the most important. That's certainly what seemed to emerge from all of the narratives that we dealt with in the edited volume, was that, the essence of the connection really was seeing beings in the world around us, like seeing the world around us as being the product of and being inhabited by ancestors in different ways. I mean, I've discussed how the mountain is a body and a god. So in the Guatemalan jungle, similarly, these sort of ancestor spirits who are sort of one Sultaca and many individual Sultacas live dispersed through the jungle environments in little hidey holes under trees or inside hills or inside caves. So the jungle landscape is in fact a map of their dwellings, and whenever we go to hunt animals or we dig a site to plow, we are kind of asking their permission to carry out these acts on their territory. And respect for these spirits is across all of the landscapes we use. Across all of the landscapes we dealt with, there are different sorts of spirits depending on the landscape that there is, but always the rituals of respect to those spirits, who are in fact responsible for having created human beings and the environments they inhabit, was always seen as prior to human life and a condition upon which human life rests. So in the Guatemalan, which is in fact the sort of Mayan cosmology, these ancestor spirits created human beings in the beginning of times, and first of all they created human beings out of wood, and they didn't work they couldn't worship the spirits properly. They were setting themselves on fire, and then they created human beings out of mud, and they couldn't worship the spirits properly, so they were done away with. And there were 5 different ages of human beings before they came up with the human beings that there now are. So it's like we're here on probation, you know. As long as we've been created in order to worship the spirits. If we can carry on doing that, then they will allow us to be here. But as soon as we stop doing that, our world will just be disposed of as every age of the world before us. So the rituals of respect are themselves the crucial connection point in this world. And across the different peoples, we've worked with people uniformly said that the world would end when people ceased to carry out the rituals, which, you know, for me as an anthropologist was quite surprising. So this is more important than extractivism. This is more important than all the young people migrating away to the city. What really is the end of your world is when these rituals stop happening. You know, in the community where I work, the older men said, oh, you know, there's just a few of us left up here now to maintain the rituals. You know, unlike everybody else, we haven't moved to the city. We stayed here because we realized the fundamental importance of this cosmogonic act of carrying out these rituals of respect. So, I mean, how can we transfer that into the modern world is then a really interesting idea. If anyone's familiar with the Dark Mountain Project and the Dark Mountain Manifesto, I see that as a way of trying to put these ideas into practice through literature, through storytelling. They're sort of based in the UK, and I mean, we have a whole sort of nature writing school here now as well, which is a process of people moving through landscape and seeing the stories which are buried in it. As yet, we only have stories of gods and ancestors. We don't have the Dark Mountain Collective perhaps have the provocation as well that these spirits, gods, ancestors, mythological beings might actually be in the landscapes that we encounter. So they're actively trying, I think, to reanimate the world around us, which, yeah, perhaps is possible. It's quite a minority pursuit at present, but maybe there is. I mean, you see, there's a sort of vast proliferation now of fantasy literature within the UK, within the modernized West. So this is possibly something that society, I would say, like on a wider level, is actually seeking toward. And just in terms of like practical acts of alienation, it is very alienating to buy your food in a supermarket which has been flown in from far away. When you are in a place, where I live now, I'm very lucky to be in the countryside here in the UK in a little cabin, and most of the food I eat is grown on the farm next door, which is a sort of a project for disadvantaged young people. So and it really gives me a great feeling of satisfaction to eat things which I know have been grown right here. So I've started taking a moment just to be thankful to the landscape for the food which I'm eating before I eat, which is a very small thing in itself, but actually it does kind of have ramifications, because it means that I'm not eating things which have vast carbon miles, come wrapped in lots of plastic, and feed into international capitalist systems. Like all of the things that I'm buying come from this local system right here, and kind of a nice charity initiative. So in finding ways to make the act of connection, like all of these other worlding practices kind of came in through the back door, as it were.
Amita has a comment. Amita, I'm going to ask you if you're still, I hope you're still here. If you can unmute and just comment face to face, if you're comfortable with that. Otherwise, I can read your comment.
Yeah. Oh, it's just a comment, and I know there's other questions. So, Rosalind, please feel free not to respond. But I was really struck by your description of reciprocity among communities, and it reminded me of ages ago reading Michael Tausig's book, The Devil in Commodity Fetishism. But then he's relating those relationships of interdependence only to the human community. He doesn't, in that book at least, extend it to include relationships of reciprocity between humans and nature.
Yes, that's very interesting. Actually, no, he doesn't. You're quite right. And in fact, I love Tausig's work. I was talking about it just before with the ayahuasca shamanism. That's his shamanism, colonialism, and the wild man. And I also greatly enjoy the devil and commodity fetishism. However, TACC was sort of taken to task by June Nash, who is another anthropologist of the Andes, whose book We Eat the Minds and the Minds Eat Us is essentially a criticism of his The Devil and Commodity Fetishism. And I think precisely along those lines, as well as several others, she simply said that he had it wrong, like he'd created this very beautiful, he's an artist as well as an anthropologist, TACC, you know, it's kind of why I like him, but this was his first book, and he had kind of created a sort of beautiful allegory of Marxist capitalism through looking at the devil and commodity fetishism, which I love as a book, but he had precisely, as you say, left out these aspects of the sort of the importance of nature and the landscape, which we eat the minds and the minds eat us. Even just in the title of June Nash's book there, you see the idea of a sort of reciprocity between humans and the landscape. Sometimes people die in the mines, so they're eaten by the mines, but then they also give people gold and so on that they can use to eat too. So it's a sort of a difficult relation of negotiated reciprocity, and so, which, you know, in the case of mining is sometimes a sort of dark reciprocal process, but nonetheless is a very sort of ancient one in the Andes, even preceding the Spaniards. But it's all about, in mining, it seems it's all about the degree to which you can push the landscape. Most mines have TO figures at the entrance, these sort of diabolic figures which have to be placated with cigarettes and booze before you can go down into the mine. And if you don't do that, then the TO is likely to kill you, and sometimes you get killed anyway.
Thank you so much.
So we have a comment from Allison recommending a book, the book Braiding Sweetgrass. This is by Native American writer and ecologist scientist called Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I also recommend. So if anyone wants to read about a very different perspective, particularly on plants, the book is called Braiding Sweetgrass. And then, Vasudha's back. So Vasudha, if you want to unmute and ask your question, please go ahead.
Well, I was very interested in all that you were saying because I work on the Himalayan mountains, and that there were lots of points of which came together about labor exchange. But the Himalayas mountain societies that I know have changed drastically. I think we've been colonized more effectively. But what I have noticed is that there is very clearly a perception of climate change. The people of my part of the Himalayan mountains understand that there's been climate change, and they see it in terms of plants. And that's why I was very struck by the simplicity with which you also found that. And how then do we integrate this? How do we talk about this? And how do we understand it? Because I mean, it may come from a completely different philosophical understanding, but the point is we have to try and see what to make of it in the context of climate change. And I must tell you that our government doesn't seem to understand it, but the people of the Himalayas seem to understand it. And that is something where I was looking for you for comments to see if there are very detailed studies about it. What is the self-perception about this? Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Yes, that's it's very interesting that's well, small scale farmers across the world and people who are living in environments are noticing these changes, and in many cases, you know, sort of noticing what a serious disturbance they're creating to natural rhythms, cycles, planting seasons, etc. But I think often, you know, sort of governments may be sheltered by cities, shopping in the supermarket, having lost precisely this act of connection that we were discussing before. Climate change is a much more distant phenomenon. It's you know, it's an economic problem perhaps, rather than a sort of a reality shaping the environment around them on an everyday basis. And of course, sort of mountain populations are, well, I mean, I think people widely notice this very much, but in mountains we have, sort of disappearing glaciers are very visible. That's something that the people who I work with talk about a lot, that the glaciers are getting smaller and smaller, as are the Himalayan glaciers. And of course, this will create huge problems. I mean, sort of unimaginably huge problems in years to come, as all of cities depending on the Himalayas for their melt off water in the dry season. That will sort of their water supply will be threatened by the lack of glaciers, as will the sort of water systems in Bolivia too. So I mean, we are running into like unimaginably huge problems, which are probably more visible to people actually inhabiting those landscapes than they are to politicians in cities, which is, hence the urgency really of paying closer attention to what such peoples are saying, which is what we're trying to do with this cosmological perspective. If you email me, there are a few anthropologists working in the Himalayas on the theme of climate change, whose names currently escape me. But and I think what we can sort of contribute from an anthropological perspective is to work closely, as I think some of these people are doing, with like local development organizations and local governance, and to see how we can bring local knowledge into the conversation in order to preserve landscapes where possible. And there was a very interesting initiative by an Indian and retired Indian engineer who started farming glaciers by creating artificial terraces in the mountains and then allowing a thin amount of water to fill them up. So I sort of farming glaciers, really, like creating artificial glaciers where there weren't glaciers anymore. Really sort of clever small scale innovation that any community could themselves create. And I think that there are also ice stupas as well. There's a sort of pipe that sends the water shooting up into the air. So it creates a sort of big ice sculpture, which then melts slowly over the dry season as it sort of sends the water up below the freezing point. This
is Ladakh, another part of the Himalayas. It's a huge, this long chain.
Yeah, right. I mean, so there are some very clever ideas like this, but of course, the engine of climate change is coming from the consumption of fossil fuels, and that is what we need to somehow be able to stop. It does, as well as individual action, we need governmental action on these things, and I agree that it's maybe not something that we're seeing in the necessary measures at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a number of thanks from numerous people and a lot of appreciation. I think that's basically it for questions. Clem does have a request if it's possible for you to share your email.
Yeah.
Would that be all right? So if you could possibly type it into the chat. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay. And I don't know if we are out of time entirely. I think we could fit in another question if anyone has one.
I think there's one from Malvika here.
Okay.
Ecuadorian rights to nature is another effort to bring the personhood of nature into the liberal democratic framework, even if far from perfect. Exactly. Yes. That's there's a very nice article actually by Marisol de la Cadena called "Is Indigenous Cosmopolitics in the Andes?" And she starts off with a letter by an indigenous activist from Ecuador, written to the Pope, talking about how we might be able to sort of bring indigenous and colonial worlding practices into conversation, which is it's a really wonderful piece. Sort of after all 500 years of Christianization, we are still here. we still believe in these things, and we're not even going to try and tell you that we are more right than you are. We're just going to say, how can we cohabit and bring these worldviews into conversation to live peacefully. So it's a really lovely piece. I quite recommend that article for anybody who is interested in learning more of this perspective. I think Marisol de la Cadena has really been who's a Peruvian anthropologist, has been the most prominent voice in this political ontology movement. I'm very much her follower.
Mm-hmm. In fact, if I can quickly squeeze in something, you know, some time ago I read the book by Eduardo Kohn called How Forests Think Towards an Anthropology Beyond the Human. Would you, oh, sorry. I think there's something else from, okay, Malvika has to go. She just had to mention that. Okay, so I'm just wondering, would you comment on, you know, because Eduardo Kohn talks about, if I'm saying his name right, he talks about, you know, living with people in Peru, I think, and trying to sense how, and he talks about semiotics and how there is and in fact, even about the possibility of human, non-human communication, not through language as we understand it, but through some kind of a semiotics, which he observes in the tribes that he lives with. But is that part of the ontological turn that you describe?
Precisely, it is. Yes, yeah. This is it's a very important text, Eduardo Collins. It's another way of formulating how these superhuman relationalities occur in a jungle context. The book is called How Forests Think, which emphasizes not how native people think about forests, but he's actually proposing that, you know, how does the forest itself think? Like, how might we formulate how a forest is thinking, how consciousness works in forests. In short, I mean, for me, it doesn't go far enough, but it's very much a description of what is and the processes that we can see kind of feeding interrelationally in forests, and how we can see people kind of communicating with those and in such a way as they can derive a subsistence from them. And it's part of the ontological turn because it takes these welding practices seriously. It not only says this is how Indigenous people think about forests, it's putting forward this is perhaps just how forests are and how they are communicating. And why don't we take this seriously?
That's really interesting. Well, I wish we had more time, but I think we have to close now. So thank you again, Rosalind, for such a wonderful and thought-provoking talk and discussion. And I hope we can carry it forward on some other occasion. And also, I just want to mention that I do believe you're planning to visit India and stay for an extended period. So perhaps we can make connections on the ground when you're there.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. I would very much enjoy that indeed. In fact, I'm looking to collaborate with any Indian institutions and scholars who are interested in this research direction. You know, I'd like to maybe apply for some funding and work across institutions on these questions whilst I'm in India, hopefully this year. You know, it would also be useful for me to have an institution where I could be a visiting fellow. If people have ideas about where might be a suitable seat for that, I'd be very grateful to hear your suggestions.
Wonderful. All right, so we are going to wrap up and thank everybody. And I'm sorry if there are any remaining questions that we can't quite take them yet. We do have one from Ahmad saying, can anyone recommend a movie that relates to the discussion? If there is something like that quickly that you can think of, then I can put it in the chat or we can make a note of it. Is there?
Yeah, well, I was just looking at a film by Tau, T-A-U Ruspoli, called Being in the World, which is on the subject of Heideggerian Dasein. So Heidegger is a sort of elephant in the room here. His thesis of being and consciousness is kind of behind a lot of this material. So, and that's a beautifully made documentary for anybody who's interested.
Okay. All right, thank you so much for that. Being in the World, and then Naga's also suggesting movies about Niyamgiri. In fact, I was thinking about Niyamgiri when you were talking about the Andes, and we can talk more about that at some point, I hope. So, so I'm hoping that this is a beginning, not an end. So thank you again, Rosalind, and everybody take good care. Thank you for attending. And we have another talk on February 8th from Sunita Narayan that I hope you can all attend. We'll be sending information about that shortly. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Goodbye. Thank you.